greatest way to start a video is just biting into a banana. That is what's gonna. That of all things, what's gonna get collect. So while I set up all the social media stuff, you can also watch me eat it. As I set up my social media, you can watch me finish this banana. But anyway, I'm just gonna get this stuff set up here. I totally like started a little late, but just how it be, you know, when you gotta run errands. And when I say run errands, I mean like take care of the house and not actually go anywhere. But I mean, it's not easy, you know. The stuff gotta do around here. Everything needs to be done, and unfortunately, flu season is around. I guess on the bright side, I'm not the one who's getting sick. The bad news is, since everyone else is getting sick, I gotta take care of everybody. So that's the real reason why I'm, you know, a little slow and things are not as well prepared as they should be. But give you a few minutes. I mean, I might as well tell you to do this. I should have done this from the get go, but I kind of like doing the whole introduction of like, hello, welcome to the stream. Parson reads, blah 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 blah. But I could just tell you like, hey guys, today we're reading Romans 11. So if you, I encourage you to have your Bibles in front of you, flip to Romans 11. That's what we're doing today. But while I finish eating this banana and finish setting up my social media stuff, you guys can chill out. If you have any preemptive questions, that's also good. I encourage that. I can't remember who said the quote, but there's always a quote I like to always think about. And it's the truth is never afraid to be challenged. Which is actually the in okay, so the original quote is something about like um, how you know something is a lie is that a lie is afraid to be challenged or something like that. And so I guess the inverse would be that the truth is not afraid to be challenged, if that makes sense. I can't remember who said the quote, but something about like basically the quote was about like how to the the rule of thumb against like dictators basically and tyrannical not just governments but like tyrannical systems and tyrannical people even. And um, the idea is that a lie is afraid to be challenged because if a lie is challenged enough, then the lie will be, you know, revealed and then thus broken. And so I guess the inverse of that I'm using is the truth is not afraid to be challenged. At least the truth should not be afraid to be challenged, which is one reason why I always encourage questions like regarding the Bible. I think it's one of those things that like, and it's one of those things that like I have a peeve about with like modern Christianity is that too many. Well, the reason why many Christians are afraid to be challenged in their faith is, quite frankly, is because they know they don't know enough about what they believe. That's the real answer, and they don't really know what Christianity is about, despite claiming to be Christian. And I mean, I know it sounds really terrible to say it that way, but it's the truth. And I mean, um, hang on. Um, 11. But what I, you know, what I encourage a lot of you, and all the more reason to like, you know, I'll tell you this little story. I know we haven't actually technically started our like Roman study, but I'll tell you this little story about how. I guess one thing that was always a problem when I was a youth pastor was I guess it never dies in me that like I take everything from a very academic angle. So for instance, when I do a Bible study or when I do like even youth groups, and this is where like I get where like it's one of those weird things where like one of the modern problems of modern youth groups and churches is that like teenagers don't want to treat like going to youth group on a Friday night as like more learning. But at the same time, it's like, well, the idea is we're trying to do outreach and teach people and inspire people to become Christian. So you kind of have an element of teaching there. Because, I mean, think about like in the Gospels, like doesn't Jesus spend most of his time like teaching? He actually spends a lot more time teaching than he does with like doing miracles. At least that's what we get from the scripture readings. Of course, there is the possibility that we could be wrong about that, and the reason simply is because once again you're limited with text, and the writers of the Gospels were more concerned about the teachings. But it's very possible he could have done a lot more miracles. But anyway, um, that's just a side theory that may not have anything to do with anything. But if you read through the Gospels, you know that like Jesus teaches a lot more than he like does anything else really. And I think that's because, and this is where like once again, I know some people will not look eye to eye with me on this one, but the reason why Jesus spends so much time teaching is because a lot of Christianity is meant to be a very intellectual exercise, and the purpose behind that is so that the idea of faith and being religious is not something that people just do with the motions, but rather, and this is where like, okay, I'm gonna use some Christianese here, but the idea of like every day you choose to believe in Jesus. Some Christians use that kind of terminology. Every day you choose to believe, and there's truth in that. And I know like the Christianese way of saying it is like super corny, but the truth behind it is that yeah, like every day you have to really think that through. But unfortunately, in our modern day and age, we're so used to instant gratification. We're used to just going through the motions and the busyness. Like this is weird paradox between like instant gratification. So stuff has to be like in the now. And then there's also this idea of you just go with the flow. Which, shameless plug-in, but that was kind of the whole conflict in Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which we have just finished the main story of that game. It's this idea of, well, if life just has this kind of flow, but in the grand scheme of things, the flow of life is actually terrible because, it is. Life isn't easy. Then why would you not want to freeze time and make the now forever and be stuck in like this perpetual present? But of course, the problem with that is you never grow up, you never change, you never seek to become better, you never allow the future to mold you. And there's a bunch of other things like that, right? And I mean that's one of those things about like when you think about modern understanding of religion. I think that's where it's really Christianity for sure has dropped the ball on that, where it has allowed itself to fall into that kind of perpetual keeping the today kind of thing, as opposed to like looking to the future, which is ironic because Christianity is all about the promises of Jesus that Jesus will bring in the future, the second coming of Christ and so on. And so if a big part of Christianity is about seeking that promise from Jesus, then you don't just get so caught up in the present, and you definitely don't want to create that perpetual present. But anyway, that's enough of those weird tangents at the beginning of the stream that have nothing to do with anything. Or maybe they do. I mean, they don't have much to do with Romans, but that's besides the point, I guess. Okay, now I remember what I totally forgot to do. Okay. See, I was so busy talking, I like didn't finish my social media things. We're just gonna do that. Now I'm gonna finish eating this banana. But before I finish eating the banana, yeah, my camera's kind of terrible. It's like awkward. I need to get a new camera. I think this is the fact of the matter because like the resolution of it's also weird, and the lens thing is not very big. It's like a small webcam, so its capabilities are very limited. You just gotta deal with it. Or rather, I gotta deal with it. But anyway, hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Romans. And today, we'll be reading Romans 11. If you have your Bibles with you, I encourage you to follow along. That's Romans chapter 11. But before we actually start, one, I'm gonna give you guys a minute. I have a heater on behind me because I live in Canada and it's cold as balls up here. I probably don't need it, so I'm gonna turn it off for a quick second. If it gets cold, I might turn it back on. But let me know if like the noise of the fan anytime I have it on in like these streams, because as it gets like into the winter months, I'll probably end up having the heater on. But if it ends up being like annoying during a stream, just let me know. And then I can always just turn it off and bear the cold for a couple of hours. I mean, I'll live. but just to let you know, that's what that annoying noise was. You also can see that it's not right behind me because there's a chair behind me, and I don't want the heater to sit on the chair because then I'll start like the heater could melt the plastic on the chair. That could be like really bad. So, secondly, I'm gonna finish this banana that I've been eating before the stream, and I know like I could have started like much later with the stream and just do all that beforehand, but I'm just too used to have it, I guess, and trying to start around 3 o'clock. But anyway, I encourage you guys to follow along. I'm using the New International Version, or NIV. So if you want to follow along, which I encourage you to do, that is the version you want to be using. You know, the weird thing to think is that in the 17th century, people fought a war over bananas of all things, which is what Donkey Kong was actually kind of based on. At least the old school Donkey Kong games. And the lore behind it was actually just based on the banana wars. Ow. You know, I got some bad news for you before we actually start Romans. And that is, I don't think I'm going to finish the Book of Romans before 2023. Just kind of an oof. You just kind of have to deal with it. That's probably my fault more than anything, so. Say la vie. Because Romans goes up to chapter 16. And we only have 5 more Fridays in the year. So, this being one of them. Well, no, I guess, no. Maybe we have, no. See, December 31st is on a Friday. But see, I'm not totally sure if I want to do streams on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. Because, that sounds kind of rough. Well, actually, it would be 2 days before Christmas and New Year. So we'll see if I end up streaming those days. There's a little bit of hesitancy on my part, and that's just probably me just being lazy more than anything, but we'll see. It'd be pretty tight if we did finish Romans before 2023, but we'll see. No promises, though. So, that's the bad news. Now let's read the good news. Romans chapter 11. So I ask, then, did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God didn't reject his people, whom he foreknew. Don't you know what the scriptures say about Don't you know what the scriptures say in the passage about Elijah? How he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, for I am the only one left, and they are trying to kill me. And what was God's answer to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be because of works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly they did not obtain. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, and ears that could not hear, to this very day. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Now again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. But rather because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgressions mean riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? I am talking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I, an apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry, in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, then so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishment from the olive root, don't consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. And you will say that branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Don't be so arrogant, but tremble, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you will also be cut off. And if they do not verse 23. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. Now after all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature, were grafted into cultivated olive trees, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Verse 25. Now I do not want you to be arrogant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Hello, Indra. Welcome to the stream. Verse 26. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies for your sake. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. Now, just as you, who were at one time disobedient to God, have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience, so they too have now become disobedient, in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. For God has bound everyone over to disobedience, so that he may have mercy on them all. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable his judgments, and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God, that God should repay them? For from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Which is weird that they decide to have a doxology, even though we're not at the end of Romans yet, but whatever. Anyway, that's the end of chapter 11. So, chapter 11 is an interesting chapter. Now, if you actually look at the general context, you'd be like, well, I guess it makes sense that Paul would talk about this. But I think there's some interesting applications that chapter 11 has, especially to Christians today, that many people can't forget. As people become believers in Christ and so on, and there are certain things we just can't forget, and you can't let go of the lineage of which you come from. That kind of thing. And so, while chapter 11 focuses primarily, well, because it's the first century, it focuses primarily between the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles. Now, I could go on this whole ass thing about like replacement theology and how it's absolute bogus, but it's apparently a thing. And you could make the argument that the book of Romans does kind of talk about that kind of thing, like the problem of replacement theology and whatnot. But I want to take this in a little bit of a different direction and talk about how, as I kind of just said, as we read through Romans 11, we should remember not to disregard the lineage of our Christian faith. And this is important because there's no nice way of saying this. Like, I guess I'm just going to preface it with that. But many a Christian have bought in too much to modernism that we have compromised the Christian faith and what it means to be Christian. And so, I've been listening to some like radio programs and whatnot, and there's always this like fear, I guess you could say, of like how you hear stories about how some churches don't really preach the gospel anymore, but rather a lot of churches have become like parrots of like social justice, for instance. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of evidence for this. This is why, like, once again, this is more like fear-mongering, and I'm a little skeptical at times when I hear this kind of stuff. But at the same time, I've also met Christians who also believe really dumb stuff. So I guess it's possible. But, I mean, to be fair, I guess someone could say the same thing about me. But you hear this kind of like, this fear about how people are abandoning, the meaning of the gospel and allowing themselves to adopt new ideologies into Christianity. And I mean, this is not the interesting thing about this is that this is not a new problem. This has been a problem since Christianity was a thing, as I've addressed back when we were starting the book of Romans. And as Paul is telling the Roman Christians, who probably the majority of them, if not all, basically all of them, like there's probably like that 1% that's actually like Jewish, but the rest of the church in Rome would have been like non-Jewish. And then of course Paul makes this whole thing in chapter 11 about the importance of bringing Israel back into the fold, if you will. And there's this weird ass metaphor that Paul uses about like grafting branches onto an olive tree. Of course, the context for that is for you, you green thumbs out there and know how grafting works. So basically, what some plants, what they do, where in order to have like better crops, you see this in like apple orchards. They'll do this, and this is the tough ass thing about apple orchards is that like there's no like one single type of apple. There's like thousands of species of apples. It's weird to think that there's like 1,000 species of apples. But in an apple orchard, you'll find like several dozen in a single orchard. And of course, the weird thing that apple orchards do is that some apple trees will have multiple types of apples on them. And the reason for that is because what they do sometimes in order to maximize their crops is that if like certain branches are weak or they're dying or whatever, they just like cut off those branches. But they're like, well, shit, now we have extra space. So why don't we maybe put like a branch from another apple tree and then like combine it into like a single apple tree. And so like, the weird thing about apple trees is that like, a single apple tree might be like some kind of Frankenstein apple tree of like several apple tree types. And that's how apple orchards, what they do this to maximize their efficiency of, to have as many apples as possible and not compromise on like the type of apple that you have, an apple's an apple at the end of the day. And so Paul uses this kind of metaphor, and they obviously do it with olives as well, which I guess is an ancient practice because Paul is talking about this in the 1st century. So clearly humans have been doing this for a pretty long time. And olive trees, this also happens because once again, you want to maximize the amount of olives you get in an olive orchard. So you're going to cut off the bad branches off a tree, and then you're just going to graft other branches and then grow new trees and whatnot. You want to maximize how many olives you're going to get. From a business perspective, the people who own these orchards, you got to make that money, it makes sense. So they came up with these practices of grafting. That's what it's called. So Paul uses this weird metaphor to describe how the family of God works. And so, I know that's a weird way of wording it, but how the family of God works is that, well, it doesn't matter who you are, like, what ethnic background you come from, gender, or whatever. But at the end of the day, we're just people. Just like how an apple is an apple at the end of the day. That's why apple orchards can, have no problem using the grafting method to maximize efficiency. An apple's an apple. So in like a cosmological sense, you could say is that, well, people are just people. And so God wants to bring all people to faith in Christ. Doesn't matter who the hell you are. And so the grafting practice would make sense. And so I guess the metaphor Paul is using is that like, okay, the root would be like the gospel message of Christ. And then from that root comes the nutrients, salvation for all of us. And then we're all like the branches. And so even though Christianity started out as like a Jewish sect, it obviously expanded beyond just being a Jewish thing, but has permeated and even taken new forms. I guess that's a weird way of wording it, but you get what I'm getting at, as it gets integrated into other cultures. And so even though, of course, now we got to get to the main theme of Romans 11, even though this grafting method has been used to integrate us non-Jews into this Jewish faith, that doesn't mean that, that the Jewish roots are to be done away with. Of course, unfortunately, in history, some people kind of did this, whether it was intentional or not, but it ended up happening. And this is where, like, replacement theology came in. For those of you who don't know what replacement theology is, the TLDR of it is this idea that some Christians believe that the church replaces the nation of Israel. And that replacement is a sense of, okay, so Israel is no longer like in God's favor. And so we can start saying stuff like how, like, oh, Christianity is not a Jewish thing, which is stupid beyond belief. Because that defeats the whole point of Christianity. It's like, well, Christianity is supposed to be for everybody. So you can't say like, oh, the Jewish people were replaced. It's like, well, no, they're just another part of it. Just like everybody else is. I mean, that would be the rational thing to think. But that ended up, developing some forms of anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism has many forms. So I'm not going to say like replacement theology in Christianity was the only aspect, the only form of anti-Semitism, even though it is one. Because there's obviously other forms of anti-Semitism that exist. But there is a big contribution to anti-Semitism in modern history that has been attributed to Christianity and replacement theology that came out of it, which, is the wrong kind of Christianity. Because, I mean, that, once again, it's a paradoxical thing. It doesn't make sense that, how can Christianity be inclusive, but then exclude people? It's kind of weird. It doesn't make any sense, if you say it out loud. It's kind of like how, I'll tell you a funny story. When I was at work, and the law got laid down, and apparently now so I have this tendency when I'm at work that I play all kinds of music, and a part of that includes like anime music and like Japanese rock and stuff like that, because I love that stuff. But apparently I'm told I can't play that anymore, because we got to play stuff that's inclusive to all the workers, but at the same time only in English. Now you say that out loud and you realize how stupid that actually sounds, right? Because when you say only, that implies exclusivity. So when you say something is only in English, that implies an exclusivity. But now the music has to be inclusive, and I get what they mean behind that, right? Like, inclusive music means like everybody can listen to it. It's not just me jamming out. But then I tried to be like a smart ass about it, and I was all like, but music is an expression of the soul and transcends language, which it does. And it transcends culture, which it does. But anyway, but it's one of those things where it's like, it sounds paradoxical, where it's like, okay, inclusive, but then you create exclusionary elements. And so replacement theology clearly doesn't work with that same flawed logic. It's like, okay, you're going to say Christianity is inclusive, but then you're going to disregard the Jews. And then that makes it exclusive. You're excluding them. That doesn't work. And so it's kind of funny, where like back in Romans 11, like it must be pretty apparent that Christians back then were running into this problem. And Paul is addressing that, like, no, you cannot forget the Jewish roots of Christianity. And so Paul makes this interesting case about how, where is it? About the promise thing. I'm trying to find where it is. Well, it's near the end here. So in verse 27 of chapter 11, Paul references, what's he referencing here? He's referencing Isaiah. And he talks about how, well, I got backtracked. I need a little bit of verse 26 for context. The deliverer will come from Zion, and he will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And so the theme of Jesus as the Messiah, and using this Isaiah prophecy, traces the messianic nature of Jesus to his Jewish roots. And so you can't separate, the task of Jesus from his works and his deliverance of Israel. You can't separate Jesus' actions with that. Is basically what Paul is trying to make the case of here by referring to this Isaiah prophecy about how the Messiah has these very Jewish roots, and he begins bringing salvation to the Israelites. And that's, Jacob is used as a metonymy for that. Because once again, Jacob's other name is Israel. So there's that too. And so you can't remove the actions of Jesus from those Jewish messianic expectations. And it would be very dangerous to do so, because if you did that, then Jesus wouldn't be Jesus anymore, and then thus the message of Jesus to the Gentiles would also be null, if that makes sense. So going back with the funky ass tree metaphors that Paul's been using, if you take out something by the root, then the whole thing dies. That's kind of true of any plant. You rip it out by the root, then it'll die. And so in a way, you could kind of view Christianity in that lens, that if you take out those Jewish roots and Jesus's, the progression of Jesus's ministry, especially if you read, like, we went through the book of Luke, go check out that playlist. But, Jesus does mention several times that, like, well, my mission is to the Jews. And then, of course, it was through that Christians then evolved the idea of, like, it expands beyond that, because it's an overflowing thing. And then, of course, in the book of Acts, Peter mentions it a little bit, but Paul was, like, gung-ho about this, where it was like first the Jews, then the Gentile kind of mantra that the Christians had. And they didn't want to abandon that Jewish roots, partly because, Christianity started out with, a bunch of Jews. So there's that. And so they didn't want to abandon those roots, even though there were much higher aspirations, reaching the world, reaching all nations, making disciples of all nations, baptizing them, and so on and so on. You cannot abandon those roots. And that's kind of the main theme of chapter 11. And it's something that I think many Christians have lost sight of that a little bit today. But not just on, like, the cultural aspects, but on a more meta dimension of, like, really losing the roots of what the gospel is about. You hear, like, these stories and these critiques about modern churches and whatnot, about how, like, for example, youth groups are kind of losing a lot of their steam, I guess you could say. And of course, a lot of young people would come with the excuse of, like, why go to church youth group on a Friday night? I just stay home and play video games, kind of thing. And of course, with the rise of everybody being introverted, because I guess everybody's introverted nowadays. Nobody wants to go out, and of course, COVID didn't help. So now you have more reason to stay in, and nobody goes out to, like, youth group kind of thing. So what churches would do to try and bring youth back in is, like, okay, everything is just, like, more fun and games as opposed to, like, actually doing what a youth group is supposed to be doing. Reaching out to teenagers with the gospel. And so there's a bit of a, you're gonna jump, right? Okay, good. I didn't want my cat to knock over my drink while she was jumping, so I had to move my hand over my cup. I didn't want her butt to go over it either, because cats do that. How cats have no regard for human property. Cats be like that. In a weird meta sense, it's probably why feminists tend to be like crazy cat ladies, because they want to adopt that kind of cat mentality of not caring about anyone else and only caring about themselves. And anyway, and so a lot of youth groups have lost this kind of idea of, like, what it means to be an outreach for young people. You lose the root of, like, having tough discussions about, well, one, Christianity and culture, how to how to be faithful in a changing world and with a lot of peer pressure. And it's one of those funny things where like even like I find a lot of like secular people do a better job of like trying to uh, make people moral in the sense of like not having teenagers not cave into peer pressure. At least like that's what 90s teenage dramas did. Of course, nowadays it's not like that. Now it's, and this is how you know society's devolved, right? Not so secular people aren't doing it, Christians aren't doing it, so no wonder like young people are just like overly hedonistic and then become extremely depressed as they get older because all like throughout their teenage years, teenagers just play the whole power hierarchy and behave really shittily toward each other, and then most people come out as losers because that's how hierarchies work. And so yeah, no wonder like people are so depressed, right? Nobody's really teaching people how to be like moral, or more importantly, how to be how to how to know God in your younger years. Now, I'm not saying that you can't become a Christian as you're older. Of course you can, but your teenage years are some of those essential years of your life, and they are your most formative years. And your spiritual life is no different. Your spiritual life is very much like that when you're a teenager. The bulk of your spiritual growth happens there. It's true. It's true. Um, and so the point of a church youth group was to really help cultivate that and be willing to challenge and question things and uh, be engaging. And I remember when I was working at this one church, and I tried that. I tried to really like create that space where like, okay, when we're doing like teenager Sunday school or like youth group, I wanted to be like, I wanted it to be a space where like we will talk about the hard things. But of course, you have the other problem of like half of these kids, kind of living really comfortable lives, so they don't know how to ask it and how to really engage. I mean, there were a few kids that were pretty great about that, but there were also a lot of them that just didn't really know, and I was like, oh crap, I got my work cut out for me, kind of thing. But at the same time, I think it's one of those things that if that's not done for you know a, for people in their teenage years, it gets that much harder. It gets that much harder. And so something that churches need to be mindful of, and trying to circle this back to Romans 11, is don't forget why you're doing what you're doing and the roots of where you come from. And so in Paul's case here in Romans 11 is, once again, don't forget the Jewish roots of your religious belief, which is also relevant to us today. But at the same time, don't forget the core of the gospel message, even when you have to adapt the way you tell the gospel to a modern audience. And so, if you guys been around the streaming Parson long enough, you guys know I use like out there metaphors when I try to explain like biblical principles. I even like use anime references whenever, like my anime of the month references whenever I'm like talking about philosophical ideas and whatever, and theological ones. But of course there is a tension, and to not say that there is one would be stupid, and that is the beginning of the pitfall that you could fall in. But this idea of don't lose the root of where you come from and what you're teaching. In the case of the gospel, don't lose the root of the gospel, even when you got to change some stylistic things up. For instance, me using anime of the month references for explaining biblical principles, or making weird comparisons with like the book of Judges and the boys kind of thing. But even though, yes, those are modern ideas and modern illustrations, something that I'm always careful of. And it's something that, anyone who teaches the Bible needs to be careful of, is that you don't run away from the roots. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You got to reset the bathwater all the time, but don't throw the baby with it. And so, with that kind of idea, that was something that you have to be very mindful of, and especially as evangelism gets more difficult to preach the gospel, because of course people will find all kinds of excuses not to listen. But and that's the reason why, like, you find pastors like myself trying to sound more hip or whatever with like our strange metaphors or whatever. But even though you're doing that, you cannot lose the root of the gospel, or you have no gospel at all, and then that would defeat the whole point of what you're doing. So, oof, I guess, but you cannot lose that root, I guess, is the main thing I'm getting at. And I guess a bit of a rant, I guess I could say, is that, like, unfortunately you find that, like, a lot of people are willing to compromise what makes Christianity Christianity. Just so you don't look like a loser in front of your friends or whatever. Uh, Hello, Nicholas. Welcome to the stream. And so you can't lose. Sorry, let me backtrack a bit. I lost my train of thought there for a second. How's it going? It's going fine. It's going fine. Just it's getting a little cold in Canada, but that's just how it be. But things are good overall. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving, Nicholas. So anyway, something that this is just my okay. So I mean, as well as this, I don't make it a secret, but at the same time, I probably haven't mentioned this in a long time. But it's no secret that the streaming Parson exists, kind of out of spite. And I've told this story before, where, like, how I went, like, through a few years of, like, looking for church work and none of it panning out. And I recently I saw a buddy, and he's got, like, his eyes kind of, like, overlooking a lot of churches. He tells me about, like, how a lot of churches struggle. And on the one hand, you're like, well, it sucks. You don't want to see a church struggle. But on the other hand, the cynical person in me is kind of like, well, you kind of had it coming, because a lot of these churches, they lack the backbone, and they're unwilling to really be bold and be brave in how they approach the modern challenges, if you will. Because of course there's two responses, right? The first response would be, you just cower into tradition. And the danger of this is basically your church becomes stagnant, nobody grows. Church is not really a place of spiritual growth, but rather spiritual retreat from the fears of the real world. So that's one response that churches do, and that's not good. The stagnant response. And the other response is to change too much and become more like the world. And at that point, well, you're not the church anymore. And so where is that healthy in the middle kind of thing? And to be fair, every church struggles with this. And I was thinking about, like, well, I think that's where you have a lot of young pastors like myself and others that I know. And I had a bunch of friends that I went to seminary with, and basically, like, how many of them are actually pastors now? I actually, like, not many. Basically, a lot of these guys I went to seminary with, and I wonder how, like, I only know, like, one guy who's a pastor. Oh, a couple of them are. One guy, though, in particular, like, it's been rough for him being a pastor. Of course, you run into other problems like church politics and whatnot, and how churches do things. And my buddy, he's ready to quit. I don't know if he already did. This was a while ago when I heard that he was thinking about it. I don't know. He could have done it already, for all I know. But at the same time, no one tells me a damn thing. So, like, I didn't even know this guy had like 2 kids at this point. So, like, shit, he had 2 kids already. But the way that, like, the reason why his church kind of did this to my buddy was because they were the group that were in the whole retreat kind of mindset. So they put on these, like, they want him to hold too much to the old way of doing things, but it's not going to work. It's not going to, you can't just keep expecting this kind of routinal thing out of your pastor. It'll wear him out, and that's why my buddy kind of wants it. He wants to quit, or has quit. I don't know if he actually did, because that can be so exhausting. Like that holding on to all the tradition, and or too much to it rather, right? And not allowing yourself to allow flexibility and change. And so that's one scenario. And then of course, you know, the the funny story I always talk about, like, for the longest time my mom would always ask me, like, why aren't you married yet, kind of thing. And I always try to dodge the question. And the reason why I would dodge the question is because I really didn't want to give my mom the real answer. And the real answer is because I have met too many Christian women that I already knew that there would be so many conflicts, because and this sounds so terrible. And part of it is like it's a tie between, like, an ethnic thing too, which only makes it worse. But I'm an old school, like, Asian church kind of guy, even though I didn't go to an Asian church growing up, which is weird. I guess because when I worked in Asian churches as an adult, that really set, like, how I thought about churches, I guess you could say. But I'm more like I am a bit more, like, traditional and conservative. And I told the funny story about how, like, even among a lot of my peers that I went to church with growing up, a lot of them don't go to church anymore, and here I am being the conservative one, which is ironic because if you had looked at us as kids, you would never have guessed that. Like, I was the kid who was playing video games, reading comic books, and doing the controversial things. And, like, because I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, so there was a lot of that whole, like, um, D&D is from the devil kind of rhetoric. But I was a person who participated in that stuff. Sorry, obligatory water noise. I'm just gonna silence this for a second. Okay, I don't think it's that annoying now. Okay, so anyway, I was the one who was, like, into, like, that kind of stuff in the 90s. And, my parents, I guess, were, like, quote unquote more liberal in that sense. But then the funny thing is that, like, we're our beliefs themselves on an intrinsic level of, like, the the tenets of Christianity, I guess you could say. Like, I'm the one who's a lot more conservative compared to a lot of my peers. And of course, like, I made this joke with, like, one of the guys I grew up with in church. He had not seen The Lion King till he was like a late teenager, because he mentioned that he had never seen it, and we were like 16 at the time. And I was, like, taken aback because, of course, like, as a kid, The Lion King was, like, one of my favorite movies. I mean, that movie's one of the best movies of all time. And I was like, what? You've never seen The Lion King? Because he had lived like a very sheltered life. And then, I mean, my buddy came back, to Christ much later in life. But there was a time where he had kind of like done his own thing and did a lot of dumb shit, in that. And then of course one of the weird things is you see his siblings and his siblings, like one of his older sister is like very anti-Christian because she's all like the whole um, Christianity is an evil colonizing belief system. So his older sister's in that camp, and then of course, I can't remember what's up with his younger brother. His younger brother also has like doesn't really go to church and kind of holds views that are like, oh, Christianity is problematic. That's a word you hear a lot, right? It's problematic. And so his younger brother, and so my buddy, he's the one who's like, he's come back to faith in recent years, but he was the one that was, now he's the one that's like the odd one in the family because a lot of his family, they don't believe anymore. And I don't want to say that like correlation is not causation, but there is a high correlation of like Christian, and you hear this a lot, especially like those celebrity stories of like celebrities that grew up in Christian homes, but like are very anti-Christian in a lot of their thinking, even though they don't say it outright. Katy Perry's like a easy example. Um, she's like has her own beliefs, but is like, okay, well then they're not Christian because they're your beliefs. They're not Christian beliefs. But you hear the story of like Katy Perry, for instance, and she grew up in a very like conservative Christian home, but then like as an adult, she was like, no, I'm not doing any of this, right? And she's just like a high profile version of the same story. And then here I am being like the weird one where it's like the complete opposite. I was the kid who was exposed to a lot of weird stuff, and my parents were totally cool with it. But then, of course, the irony is that like the idea of my parent behind that was that when my parents were raising me, they taught me to think for myself. And so when I became a Christian, it was me reading the scriptures and studying it thoroughly and studying other things too. And then I came to that decision. I thought it through myself. And so trying to tie it back to Romans now, you cannot forget your roots. And this is something that many, as time passes, and yeah, people change, but to really hold on to your Christian beliefs, you got to remember where you came from. And now I'm going to speak on a more like micro level, I know the book of Romans has a more like nationalistic view. I already talked about it on like a more meta um, societal view, but on a personal level, as you come to faith and some of you guys may have cooler stories of how you became Christians, because the joke is that my story is very uncool. It was like, yeah, grew in a Christian home, even though my parents were kind of out there in their way of raising me, but eventually my parents taught me to think for myself. And so as I read the Bible as a teenager and really studied and researched, then I came to faith through the evidence that like, oh yeah, of course it makes sense for this to be true. And so that is how I came to faith. I know, right? Like that's the story right there. Nothing interesting about it. I don't have some crazy story about like having like a spiritual encounter, after like my life going down like 50 kinds of crappers. Like I always made the joke about my buddy Jamal. I mean, we can laugh about it now, but Jamal, he had like the worst past before he became a Christian. He was like a child soldier, and then he like ran away from that, and then eventually he like ended up in like doing hard drug, like deep in drugs and alcohol, and then like he became like a gangster and stuff like that. Like it was a crazy ass ride that he had before he like had that spiritual encounter at like the Union Gospel. And so, some people have those kind of stories, and I am not one of them. But once again, it doesn't matter where you come from. You got to remember how Jesus saved you. And so whether it was knowing the truth of the gospel of like, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. And since that is the case, since that's true, then everything else he says must be true. Or you go through the more crazy story and have the spiritual encounter. But you cannot lose that root of where you come from. And so I think that's where I know I'm gonna like step on a lot of tacks here, but I do believe that like people can quote unquote lose their salvation. I do believe that, because the idea that it's not so much of like, okay, I guess the wording is problematic. It's not like, you know, a coin in your pocket that like magically slips out and you lost it. It's not one of those kind of losing your salvation. But you can give it up, and therefore it is a loss. And when I say like a loss, I mean like, you know, when you roll black and the ball lands on red, kind of thing. Like that kind of loss. And people do that. They'll put their trust and their faith in other things, and they'll abandon what made them saved in the first place. You know, the Spirit of Christ and His forgiveness. And people will abandon that. And in that sense, you can lose your faith. You can lose your salvation in that sense, because, you know, if you stop believing, then, you know, it can't do anything for you. That's just the matter of fact. And so, well, I mean, there's another dimension to that as well, and I could go into it more later, but let's go back to, you know, the whole theme of Romans of not losing where you come from kind of thing. And I think the reason why people slip away in their belief is because they lose sight of that. They lose sight of what led them to be saved, and the fact that they were saved. You know, the root of that, and the root of that ultimately being, well, Christ's death and His forgiveness in that death. And I think many people lose sight of that. And to be fair though, I mean, that's something that you have to be very very attentive. No, that's not the word. Very conscientious. That's the word. You have to be very conscientious of it. And this goes back to that whole, you know, that Christianese phrase that I hate, but it's so true. Well, the reason why I hate the wording, because I hate the way that like when people use Christianese, that you're skipping over like very important context. But this idea of like, well, every day you choose to believe in Jesus, which once again is true. But I hate the wording, because a lot when people say that, they skip over the context of what makes it important, and the idea of being conscientious about where you come from and how you got to where you are now. And you know, that road is clearly a bumpy road, and that's true for everybody. You know, nobody has the perfect, nicely paved road. But, you know, you've come from a long way, and to remember that, you know, that Christ was there with you along that road, and Christ has brought other people along on that road with you. And, you know, I say this a lot, you know, that you're not alone in this, right? In your struggles, because, you know, obviously you have Christ, and when Christ is, you know, if Christ is for you, who can be against you? But, you know, it's not like this whole like magic 8-ball thing where it's like you have Christ there for all problems solved. But rather, you know, Christ brings the right people in the right moments in your life. And you look back on all that and what God has done for you. And this is where, you know, I guess it's appropriate, because yesterday was Thanksgiving. And I mean, I already mentioned this when we had October Thanksgiving, but um, you know, to always be thankful. And once again, it's one of those things where like Thanksgiving isn't like a single day. Thanksgiving is every day, where you're thankful for what God has done in your life, and more importantly, how Christ has saved you from sin and saved you from your inner demons and all that. That Christ has freed you and given you life. To be thankful for that and to never lose sight of that past, of who you are. But of course, at the same time, you can't just dwell on that. You can't just dwell on the past nostalgia, but rather to move forward and to build a new life. And that's what, the Bible talks about. The Christianese word is sanctification. And the idea behind that is, well, where do you go from there? How do you move forward now that Christ has redeemed you, Christ has saved you, Christ has cleansed you of your sin? Where do you go from there? And how do you move forward from there? And so there's this interesting, back and forth. And when Paul is appealing to the Romans to not forget the Jewish roots of Christianity, and he talks about how, like, even though Israel rejected God and rejected Jesus, well, Christ has saved you. And in that same vein, Christ can save anyone, which is, all the more true. Because if the Jews were then excluding God, that technically, by transient properties, makes everybody enemies of God. But yet God still reconciled with the Gentiles, the people who were far away. And so if God can make reconciliation with the Romans, as is implied in the book of Romans, and these Roman Christians, well, then God can save anyone. God can redeem anyone. God can forgive anyone. And so with that said, when you come to faith, it doesn't matter who you are, God can save anyone. And at the root of Christianity is the belief that Jesus has come to save everyone. Whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have life eternal. And so God can save anyone. And don't ever lose sight of that. Don't ever lose sight of that. And that is the root of Christianity. Anyway, I'll just make a note about this doxology, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. Because there's not much else to really say about Romans 11. I mean, I kind of just hammered it already with, like, the whole roots thing. But I just want to make it a little, like, I guess it's not a narrative, I guess, but, like, what's the textual aspects of the ending of chapter 11, which is kind of weird because it's what we call a doxology. And a doxology, I know it's a weird Christianese word, but a doxology is basically, well, it's not a Christian exclusive thing. Every religion does it. A doxology is basically it's a confession of faith within a religious community. If that makes sense. So every church usually does one. I mean, it makes sense. Every religious gathering tends to have one. A doxology is basically like, yes, we affirm what we believe, and this is what we believe. And so in Romans 11, from Romans 11's doxology is the belief of, how great God is. Who could understand his ways? He's so much more great than we are. He is beyond our ways. And it works. What makes the doxology work in chapter 11, even though typically in a church service you would throw the doxology at like the very end before you dismiss everybody, but in chapter 11 the doxology goes with the rest of the theme in chapter 11. This whole, even though Israel had abandoned God saved the Gentiles and will come back for the Jews, because God will save everyone, whoever believes in him. because there are conditions. But basically, God will save everyone. So with that in mind, the doxology makes total sense within chapter 11's context. Look how great he is, and so beyond our understanding. You know, it seems so weird where, like, it would seem weird that, like, yeah, Israel broke off, and then God's, like, what, go somewhere else to create disciples? No. I mean, well, yes, but, like, he doesn't abandon Israel. But rather, this is just part of a bigger plan to bring all people into the family of God, into, you know, the fold, if you will. And so, yes, God's ways are so much greater than ours. And the doxology affirms this. And so Paul is just really affirming that. And at the end, by saying amen, it's like, yes, you know, we agree that this is the truth, that God will save all people. And whoever believes in him shall not die, but have life eternal. Anyway, that's basically it for Romans 12. Short chapter, short theme talk about just don't forget your roots, which is why the tree metaphor actually works in the chapter. Of all things, don't forget your roots. Anyway, so that's going to be the end of our reading for today. We'll do some housekeeping. If you have any questions, you know, go ahead and shoot. So for housekeeping, basically next week I'm going to do some post game for Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I don't know how many post game streams I'm going to do. Might do like maybe 2 weeks, because I don't think I could cover it all in one. I think I might need 2 weeks to do the post game, which will actually bring us into like the second week of December. So with that said, you know, we'll be into the Christmas season, and we'll see what we end up doing for the Christmas season. I don't really have a lot of ideas. So, I mean, I'm tempted just to like take time off actually during December. Like, we'll just do the Book of Romans, finish it off. But I don't think I'm going to do any game streams after I finish Xenoblade for a little while. Take a short break and then maybe start at something in the new year. That's kind of what I'm thinking. So, yeah, that's basically it. Of course, our Xenoblade Chronicles 3 streams will be on Monday and Wednesday at 2 o'clock Pacific time. And then next Friday, we will read Romans 12. Anyway, with that said, I don't see any questions, so with that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed following along in the Book of Romans. If you guys learned something, you guys, you know, think about what it means to know your roots and to understand, you know, where you came from and God's hand in it. But anyway, with that said, I hope you guys have a great Friday night. I hope you guys have a great weekend. And I will see you guys on Monday for Xenoblade Chronicles. Good night, and God bless you.